love that image of coming home weary because of our sin, weary because of our striving, and coming home to the Father's house, the house of rest. If you have a Bible, let's turn to Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, and this is more of a rhetorical question. You don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you like to be tired? How many of you like to be hungry? Some of you who have little kids have witnessed with your own two eyes as your children go from being perfect little angels into rapidly transformed into fallen angels, into demons when they're tired or when they're hungry. Maybe you say, I see that with my teenagers, or I've seen that with my husband. Snickers actually had a campaign of commercials, "You're not you when you're hungry." There's something about being sleep deprived, there's something about being hungry that really God doesn't want to see in his children. That's what we're going to see this morning, is that God cares about your food. God cares about your sleep. That just as we don't look at our kids and want them to be tired or hungry, so the Heavenly Father looks at us as his children and says, I don't want them to be tired or to be hungry. And we're going to see that principle and its application in today's text. Look with me, if you would, at Mark 2, verse 23. And it came to pass that he, that's Jesus, went through the cornfields. Now in the Greek, it's not quite that specific. It could be grain fields, barley fields, but since I'm from Indiana, let's picture corn. That's what I think of when I think of a field. On the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn or the heads of grain. Now, in that day, because there weren't highways with a Cracker Barrel at every exit, travelers would often cut through a field, and that's exactly what Jesus and his disciples are doing. And because they were hungry, again, there was no fast food, there was no restaurant they could stop at, so they decided they would just pluck a nourishing snack on their way. You've heard of farm to table. This was farm to face. And it was very organic, healthy, whole wheat, non-pesticide grain. Now, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Fast food from your hand to your mouth, and it's healthy, it's nourishing, it's free. There's only one problem. What we don't realize yet in the story is that the disciples are being stalked, no pun intended, as they're going through the stalks. The Pharisees are watching them. The Pharisees' spies are spying on Jesus and his disciples. Verse 24, and the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, what do they? What are your disciples doing on the Sabbath day? That which is not lawful? Now, this is the fourth time that the Pharisees and scribes have attacked Jesus in chapter 2. More than the demons, more than the Romans, more than Satan himself. The Pharisees and these religious people are attacking Jesus. In fact, we're going to see in this passage two traits of Pharisees. And maybe we could phrase it this way. You might be a Pharisee if, number one, you're always right, even though you're often wrong. The Pharisees, in levying this accusation, have in it a very clear implication. And that is this: Jesus, if you let your disciples, your followers, arbitrarily, willy-nilly just break the law, you don't care, you're turning a blind eye to the fact that they are lawbreakers, doesn't that mean that you don't care about God's law? See, we're right, and you're wrong. Well, Jesus is going to counter not only the Pharisees' argument, but also the Pharisees' thinking, because were the Pharisees right? Were the disciples doing that which was not lawful? And you might say, well, yeah, they're stealing from these poor farmers. This isn't their land. These aren't their fields. They're taking grain, they're taking produce that isn't theirs. And yet, The reality is God had established in the Old Testament that he cares about his children. Again, he doesn't want to see his children tired. He doesn't want to see his children hungry. And so he made a provision in the Old Testament that travelers going through a field could indeed pluck some of the produce and eat it. Listen to Deuteronomy 23, verse 25. When you come into the standing corn of your neighbor, then you may pluck the ears of corn with your hand, the ears with your hand. But you shall not move a sickle unto your neighbor's standing corn. So again, they didn't have Chick-fil-A's on the side of the road, and if they had, they would have been closed on the Sabbath because it's Chick-fil-A. So God says, you can take some of the grain. You're hungry. Take some of the grain for provision, but not for profit. Don't come out with a sickle and start harvesting your neighbor's grain. Just pick what you need. Many of us enjoy this time of year in the fall because we like to take our families up to North Carolina, to the Hendersonville area, and there are all these apple orchards. And what's really nice is when you take your family to one of the orchards and they let you, as you're picking your apples, sample the apples. So you can decide if you like Jonagolds or Honeycrisps or Pink Ladies or all these different types of apples that they have there at the orchard. And that's perfectly fine. They tell you you can sample, try out, decide what you like, and then fill your basket with those apples. Now, what if you decided, hey, this is a great deal. I'm going to take advantage of their generosity, and I'm going to bring my whole family, starving, or my whole literary society, ravenous guys, in a bus up to the orchard, and we're going to eat all we want, stuff our faces, and just leave without paying for anything, not even those delicious little donuts. We're just going to go and eat all these apples and leave. Or worse than that, we're actually going to take harvesting equipment, big trucks up there, and start stripping row after row of apples and harvest their apples and then just leave without paying for them. And obviously the answer is no. That is abusing their generosity. And so this rule that's designed to help you sample and decide what kind of apple you want, you could abuse that, and that's what Deuteronomy is warning against. But it doesn't ever forbid plucking some of the produce. In fact, it says you can do that. The previous verse says you can do that in vineyards. That verse says in verse 25, you can also do that in fields. You say, well, is it wrong because not that they were taking the grain, but that they were doing it on the Sabbath? I mean, is that what makes the disciples wrong and the Pharisees right? But again, the Pharisees just thought that they were right. If you read the Old Testament, what the disciples was doing here is fine. In Exodus 34, God clearly forbids his people Israel from harvesting on the Sabbath, but Deuteronomy 23 says it's fine to pick some kernels of grain on the Sabbath. It's not forbidden. In fact, God expressly says it's fine. He doesn't want his children to go hungry.